Today you're going to hear the incredible story of Samuel Hayes, a man who lost everything he held dear in the harsh landscapes of 1870s Wyoming. When the law threatened to take away his ranch, the last piece of his beloved wife's memory, he was forced into an impossible choice: marry a complete stranger or lose his land forever. But what he discovered in this mysterious woman's eyes would change not only his fate, but heal a heart he thought was broken beyond repair. Before we begin this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a morning song, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another harsh winter. Samuel Hayes stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, his calloused hands gripping the wooden railing as he stared out at the vast expanse of land that had been his whole world for the past 15 years. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, casting long shadows across the prairie grass that swayed like ocean waves in the evening breeze. At 42, Samuel's face bore the deep lines of a man who had known both profound joy and devastating loss. His dark hair, now streaked with premature gray, fell across his brow as he lowered his head, the weight of the letter in his shirt pocket feeling heavier than any burden he had ever carried. The official document from the territorial government had arrived 3 days ago, and its contents had shattered the fragile peace he had managed to build around himself since Margaret's death 2 years prior. The Homestead Act was clear in its requirements. A man must be married or have a family to maintain his claim on more than 160 acres. When Samuel had first claimed this land with Margaret by his side in 1855, they had been young, hopeful, and desperately in love. Together, they had built their ranch from nothing, raising cattle and horses while dreaming of the children who would one day inherit their little empire. But those children never came, and when consumption took Margaret during the brutal winter of 1872, Samuel found himself alone on 2,000 acres that suddenly felt as empty as his heart. The letter stated that he had 30 days to either marry or forfeit all but 160 acres of his land to the territorial government, which would then auction it off to families who met the requirements. The very thought of losing Margaret's garden, the meadow where they had picnicked every Sunday after church, or the hill where she was buried, made Samuel's chest tighten with a grief so fresh it felt like yesterday's wound. He pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again, though he had memorized every word. The lamplight from inside the house cast a warm glow through the windows, illuminating the space that Margaret had made into a home with her gentle touch. Her rocking chair still sat by the fireplace, her needlework basket still waited on the side table, and her china teacup still held its place on the kitchen shelf, small shrines to a love that death could not diminish. "What am I supposed to do, Maggie?" he whispered to the evening air, his voice rough with emotion. "How can I bring another woman into our home? How can I promise to love someone else when my heart is buried on that hill with you?" The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through his reverie, and Samuel looked up to see his neighbor, Thomas Millfield, riding up the dirt path that led to his house. Thomas was one of the few people who understood Samuel's pain. He had lost his own wife to childbirth 5 years earlier and had remarried out of necessity rather than love. His weathered face beneath his wide-brimmed hat spoke of resignation rather than happiness. "Evening, Sam," Thomas called out as he dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Thought I'd ride over and see how you're holding up." Samuel folded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket. "Well enough, I suppose. Come on up and have a drink with me." Thomas climbed the steps and settled into the chair beside Samuel, accepting the glass of whiskey that his friend poured from the bottle he kept on the porch table. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "Got word from town today," Thomas finally said, his voice careful and measured. "Judge Harrison mentioned that you might be having some trouble with the territorial office." Samuel took a long drink of whiskey, feeling its burn chase away some of the chill that had settled in his bones. "Seems like everybody knows my business before I do these days. It's a small town, Sam. People talk because they care." Thomas leaned forward in his chair, studying his friend's profile. "Have you given any thought to what you're going to do?" "Every thought in my head for the past 3 days," Samuel replied with a bitter laugh. "None of them good ones." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then cleared his throat. "There might be another way, Sam. Something Judge Harrison mentioned when we were talking." Samuel turned to look at his neighbor, seeing something in Thomas's expression that made him straighten in his chair. "What kind of other way?" "Well, you know Martha Billings, the widow who runs the boarding house in town." When Samuel nodded, Thomas continued, "She's got a niece coming in on the stage from Boston. Girl named Sarah. Lost her family in a fire and has nowhere else to go. Martha's been writing letters back and forth with her for months trying to arrange something. Samuel's grip tightened on his glass. I don't see what that has to do with my situation. Martha's getting on in years, Sam. She's 73 and can barely manage the boarding house as it is. She can't take care of a young woman too, especially one who's going to need time to heal from her own losses. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. She mentioned that Sarah might be willing to enter into a marriage of convenience with a good man who could provide for her. Nothing more than a legal arrangement to help both parties. The suggestion hit Samuel like a physical blow. He set his glass down hard on the table, sloshing whiskey onto the worn wood. You're talking about me marrying a stranger, Thomas. A complete stranger who doesn't know me from Adam, and who I've never laid eyes on. I know how it sounds, Sam. But think about it. You'd keep your land. She'd have a home and protection, and neither of you would have to pretend it was anything more than a practical arrangement. Thomas leaned closer, his voice earnest. From what Martha says, this Sarah girl understands what it means to lose everything. She's not looking for romance or grand gestures. She just needs security. Samuel stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch, gripping the railing again as he stared out at the darkening landscape. The idea of bringing another woman into his home, of standing before a preacher and making vows to someone he didn't know, felt like a betrayal of everything he and Margaret had shared. But the alternative, losing the ranch they had built together, felt equally impossible. When is she supposed to arrive? He heard himself ask, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Tuesday morning stage. That gives you 4 days to think about it and maybe ride into town to meet her before making any decisions. Thomas stood and moved to stand beside his friend. Martha says she's a good girl, Sam. Educated, well-mannered, and strong enough to survive what she's been through. She's not looking to replace anyone's memory, just trying to build a new life from the ashes of her old one. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical force. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice echoing across the prairie with a loneliness that matched his own. He thought of Margaret's grave on the hill, of the promises he had made to her both in life and death, and of the ranch that represented every dream they had ever shared. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. That's all anyone can ask, Sam. Just remember, sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that end up saving us. After Thomas left, Samuel remained on the porch long into the night, wrestling with a choice that felt impossible no matter which way he looked at it. The stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, and somewhere in their distant light, he searched for an answer that seemed as elusive as the wind. The next 4 days passed in a blur of restless nights and tormented days. Samuel found himself unable to focus on the daily tasks that usually provided some measure of peace. Mending fences, checking on the cattle, maintaining the equipment that kept his ranch running. Every chore felt hollow, every familiar routine tainted by the uncertainty that hung over his future like a storm cloud. On Monday evening, he made his decision. Samuel stood before Margaret's grave as the sun set behind the rolling hills, his hat in his hands and his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. The simple wooden cross he had carved himself bore her name and the dates that marked her too brief life. Margaret Rose Hayes, beloved wife, 1831-1872. The wildflowers he had planted around the gravesite had grown thick and tall, creating a natural garden that would have made her smile. I don't know if what I'm about to do is right or wrong, Maggie, he said softly, his voice carrying across the prairie grass. But I can't lose this place. I can't lose everything we built together. Maybe this Sarah understands what it means to carry grief. Maybe we can help each other bear our burdens without forgetting the people we've lost. The wind stirred the flowers at his feet, and for just a moment, Samuel allowed himself to imagine it was Margaret's gentle hand touching his face, giving him permission to do what he must to survive. Tuesday morning found Samuel riding into Millbrook earlier than he had in months. The small frontier town bustled with its usual activity, merchants opening their shops, women heading to the general store with their marketing baskets, children running between the buildings with the boundless energy of youth. The stage depot sat at the center of town, a sturdy building surrounded by benches where travelers could wait for their connections. Samuel tied his horse to the hitching post outside Martha Billings's boarding house and climbed the steps to the wide front porch. Martha emerged before he could knock, her silver hair pinned back in a neat bun, and her kind blue eyes bright with anticipation. Samuel Hayes, she said warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas told me you might be coming by today. The stage should be here within the hour. Mrs. Billings, Samuel replied, removing his hat. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I'm not making any promises, I just want to meet the young lady and see if we might be able to help each other. Martha's expression softened with understanding. Of course, dear. Sarah knows this might be a possibility, and she's of the same mind. She's been through enough heartache to understand that sometimes practical arrangements serve everyone better than romantic notions. She gestured toward the chairs on her porch. Come sit with me while we wait. Let me tell you a bit about her. Samuel settled into the offered chair, his hands resting on his knees as Martha began to speak. Sarah Collins is 26 years old, and until 6 months ago, she lived with her parents and younger brother in a fine house in Boston. Her father was a teacher at a private academy, and her mother took in sewing from the wealthy families in their neighborhood. Sarah herself worked as a governess for a banker's family, 3 young children who adored her. Martha's voice grew somber. The fire started in the middle of the night. A chimney problem, the investigators said. Sarah was the only one who made it out. Samuel felt his chest tighten with sympathy. He knew intimately what it meant to lose everything in an instant, to wake up one day and find your entire world changed beyond recognition. She's been staying with distant cousins since then, but they made it clear she wasn't welcome for long. That's when she wrote to me. Martha reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded letter. She's honest about her situation, Samuel. She knows she needs security, and she's not ashamed to admit it, but she's also educated, capable, and stronger than she probably realizes. The distant sound of the stage horn echoed across the prairie, and both Samuel and Martha looked up to see the dust cloud that announced the arrival of the weekly coach. Samuel's heart began to beat faster, as the reality of what he was considering hit him with full force. The stage rolled into town with its usual fanfare, horses snorting and stamping, the driver calling out greetings to familiar faces, passengers emerging stiff and dusty from their long journey. Samuel watched as several people disembarked, a traveling salesman with his sample cases, an elderly couple visiting family, and finally, a young woman in a simple but well-made black dress. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that Sarah Collins carried herself with quiet dignity, despite the obvious weariness of travel. Her auburn hair was pinned back beneath a modest bonnet, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to be cautious in an uncertain world. She was smaller than he had expected, but there was something in her posture that spoke of inner strength. That's her, Martha said softly, rising from her chair. Come, let me introduce you. They walked across the dusty street to where Sarah stood beside the stage, a single worn carpet bag at her feet, and her hands folded in front of her. As they approached, she looked up, and Samuel found himself meeting the darkest brown eyes he had ever seen. They were eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone so young, but they held no self-pity, only a quiet acceptance of whatever life might bring. Sarah, dear, Martha said warmly, embracing her niece. Welcome to Millbrook. How was your journey? Long but uneventful, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of her Boston upbringing. Thank you for letting me come, Aunt Martha. I know this isn't easy for you. Nonsense. Martha waved away her concern. Now I'd like you to meet someone. This is Samuel Hayes, the gentleman I mentioned in my letters. Sarah turned her full attention to Samuel, and he felt an unexpected jolt as their eyes met. There was no coquettishness in her gaze, no attempt to charm or impress. Instead, she studied him with the same careful assessment he was giving her, as if they were both evaluating a business proposition, which he supposed they were. Mr. Hayes, she said, offering a small curtsy. Aunt Martha has told me about your situation. I understand you're considering a marriage of convenience to maintain your property rights. Her directness surprised him. Most women of his acquaintance would have blushed and stammered around such a delicate subject, but Sarah addressed it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. Yes, ma'am, Samuel replied, finding his voice. And I understand you're in need of security. I am. She met his gaze steadily. I won't pretend this is an ideal situation for either of us, Mr. Hayes, but I believe we might be able to reach an arrangement that serves us both. Martha looked between them with approval. Why don't we go back to the boarding house? Sarah, you must be tired and hungry from your journey, and you both need time to talk properly. As they walked back across the street, Sarah's carpet bag in Samuel's hand, he found himself stealing glances at this unexpected woman who spoke of marriage with the same calm practicality she might use to discuss the price of flour. There was something almost unsettling about her composure, a control that reminded him of his own carefully maintained emotional barriers. Back at the boarding house, Martha bustled about preparing tea and sandwiches while Samuel and Sarah sat in the parlor, the awkwardness of their situation settling between them like an uninvited guest. Sarah removed her bonnet, revealing hair the color of autumn leaves and a face that, while not classically beautiful, held an arresting quality that made it difficult to look away. "Perhaps we should be frank with each other," Sarah said, smoothing her skirts. "I know this is unusual, Mr. Hayes, but my circumstances have taught me that survival sometimes requires unconventional choices." Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying this remarkable woman who seemed to possess a strength that her delicate appearance belied. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Collins?" "A marriage in name only," she replied without hesitation. "I would keep your house, help with whatever domestic duties you require, and provide the legal status you need to keep your land. In return, you would provide me with shelter, security, and the protection of your name." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her sleeve. "I wouldn't expect affection, Mr. Hayes, nor would I offer it. We would simply be two people helping each other survive." The bluntness of her proposal should have been refreshing, but instead, Samuel found himself slightly unsettled by her complete lack of emotional expectation. It was exactly what he thought he wanted, yet hearing it stated so clinically made something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. "And what about the future?" he asked. "What if circumstances change? What if one of us wants something different?" For the first time since meeting her, Sarah's composure wavered slightly. She looked down at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter. "I don't expect circumstances to change, Mr. Hayes. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago, and I suspect you're not the same man you were before you lost your wife. Sometimes people break in ways that can't be fixed. We can still be useful to each other, even if we can't be whole." Her words hit Samuel with unexpected force, recognizing in them an echo of his own thoughts during the darkest days after Margaret's death. Here was someone who understood that grief could fundamentally alter a person, leaving them capable of function, but perhaps not of the kind of love they had once known. Martha returned with a tray of tea and fresh-baked bread, her timing impeccable as always. The elderly woman had a gift for knowing when conversations needed gentle interruption, and she settled the refreshments between Samuel and Sarah with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades caring for travelers and strangers. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said diplomatically, though Samuel caught the meaningful look she gave her niece. "Sarah, your room is ready upstairs whenever you need to rest." After Martha departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the parlor. Samuel found himself studying Sarah's profile as she poured tea with steady hands, noting the way she held herself with careful precision, as if maintaining perfect control had become a necessity rather than a choice. "You said you worked as a governess," Samuel said, accepting the cup she offered him. "Did you enjoy it?" Sarah's lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I did. The children were wonderful, curious, and bright. Their mother was kind to me, and their father treated me with respect." Her expression grew distant. "I had planned to save enough money to perhaps open a small school someday. I thought I had time to build the life I wanted." Samuel heard the unspoken grief in her words, the dreams that had died along with her family. "I'm sorry for your losses, Miss Collins. I know something about how it feels when the future you planned disappears overnight." She looked at him then, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped enough to reveal the depth of pain she carried. "Aunt Martha told me about your wife. How long were you married?" 17 years, Samuel replied, his voice roughening slightly. "We were childhood sweethearts. I can't remember a time when Margaret wasn't part of my life." He set down his teacup with deliberate care. "I won't lie to you, Miss Collins. Some days I still set 2 places at the table without thinking. Some nights I still reach for her side of the bed. If we do this thing, you need to understand that you'd be sharing a house with a ghost." Sarah nodded slowly, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "And you need to understand, Mr. Hayes, that I wake up some mornings forgetting that my family is gone. I catch myself listening for my mother's voice or my brother's laughter. We're both haunted people. Perhaps that makes us more suitable for each other than we might initially appear." The honesty in her words surprised him. Most people tried to hide their pain, to present a facade of recovery and moving forward. But Sarah spoke of her grief as a simple fact, something to be acknowledged rather than concealed. "There would be conditions," Samuel said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I have a ranch to run, Miss Collins. It's not an easy life, especially for someone accustomed to city comforts." "I grew up on a farm before my father became a teacher," Sarah replied. "I know how to work, Mr. Hayes. I can cook, clean, tend a garden, and care for animals. I'm not afraid of hard work. It's idleness that I find difficult to bear." Samuel found himself nodding in understanding. Work had been his salvation in the dark months after Margaret's death, the physical demands of ranch life providing a buffer against the endless hours when grief threatened to overwhelm him. "And the sleeping arrangements?" he asked, feeling heat rise in his cheeks despite his determination to treat this as a business arrangement. "Separate rooms," Sarah said without hesitation. "I assume your wife's things are still in the main bedroom. I wouldn't want to disturb them, and I imagine you wouldn't want me to." Her assumption was correct, and Samuel felt a mixture of relief and something else, disappointment perhaps, at her matter-of-fact acceptance of their emotional limitations. "There's a small room off the kitchen that I could make comfortable," he said. "It has a window and stays warm from the cook stove." "That sounds perfect." Sarah smoothed her skirts again, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as a nervous habit. "When would you need this arrangement to begin?" "Aunt Martha mentioned you have a deadline." 26 days, Samuel replied, the number feeling like a countdown to his own execution. "The territorial office requires proof of marriage, not just engagement." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the teacup in her hands. When she looked up, her expression was resolute. "Then we should proceed quickly. There's no benefit to prolonging the uncertainty for either of us." The speed with which she reached the decision left Samuel momentarily breathless. In the space of a single afternoon, he was apparently planning to marry a woman he had known for less than 2 hours. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings, but the practical part, the part that had kept him alive through Margaret's illness and death, recognized the sound logic of Sarah's approach. "Judge Harrison could perform the ceremony," Samuel said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "He's known me for years and understands the situation." "Would Friday be acceptable?" Sarah asked. "That would give us 3 days to prepare." Samuel nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what preparation such an arrangement would require. "I'll speak with the judge tomorrow and make the arrangements." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their agreement settling between them like a bridge they would soon have to cross. Finally, Sarah set down her teacup and looked directly at him. "Mr. Hayes, I want you to know that I don't take this lightly despite how it might appear. I understand that we're both making significant sacrifices, and I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to make this arrangement bearable for both of us." "As will I, Miss Collins," Samuel replied, rising from his chair. "I should let you rest now. The journey from Boston couldn't have been easy." Sarah stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other in the dim parlor, two strangers about to embark on the most intimate legal relationship possible. She was smaller than he had initially thought, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but there was something formidable about her presence that had nothing to do with physical size. "Mr. Hayes," she said as he reached for his hat, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think it's possible for two people to find peace together without love, to build something worthwhile from practical necessity?" The question caught him off guard with its vulnerability. For the first time since meeting her, Sarah sounded uncertain, younger than her 26 years. "I don't know," Samuel answered honestly, "but I think maybe peace is more valuable than I used to believe, and maybe building something worthwhile doesn't always require the same foundation." Sarah nodded slowly. "I hope you're right." Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October, as if the weather itself was trying to make their unconventional wedding day more pleasant. Samuel had spent the intervening days in a state of nervous activity, cleaning the house more thoroughly than it had been cleaned since Margaret's death, and preparing the small room off the kitchen for Sarah's occupation. He found himself standing before his wardrobe that morning, staring at the black suit he had worn to Margaret's funeral, wondering if it was appropriate attire for a marriage that felt more like a business transaction than a celebration. In the end, he chose his best shirt and pants, clean but not festive, respectful but not joyful. Judge Harrison's office occupied the second floor of the courthouse, a small but dignified space lined with law books and framed certificates. Samuel arrived early, his palms sweating despite the cool morning air. Martha and Thomas had agreed to serve as witnesses, and they waited with him in the wooden chairs that faced the judge's desk. When Sarah arrived, Samuel felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, and she had arranged her auburn hair in a style that was both modest and becoming. She looked like a woman preparing for an important occasion, though certainly not like a blushing bride. "Miss Collins," Judge Harrison said warmly, rising from behind his desk, "I'm honored to perform this ceremony for you and Samuel. He's one of the finest men in this territory." Sarah smiled politely and took her place beside Samuel, her hands folded calmly in front of her. The judge opened his book and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. But Samuel found himself only half listening, his attention focused on the woman standing beside him. When the time came for vows, they exchanged simple promises of mutual support and respect rather than declarations of love. Sarah's voice was steady as she promised to honor their agreement, and Samuel found himself meaning the words he spoke about protection and care more than he had expected. "You may kiss the bride," Judge Harrison announced, but Samuel and Sarah simply shook hands, a businesslike gesture that somehow felt more honest than false passion would have been. And just like that, Samuel Hayes was married again. The small celebration that followed at Martha's boarding house was subdued but pleasant. Sarah thanked everyone graciously for their kindness, and Samuel found himself watching her navigate the social expectations with the same calm competence she had shown throughout their brief courtship. As the afternoon wore on and it came time to leave for the ranch, Samuel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He was bringing another woman into the home he had shared with Margaret, and despite all the rational reasons for the arrangement, it felt like a betrayal of everything sacred in his memory. Sarah seemed to sense his mood as they rode toward the ranch in his wagon, her hands folded in her lap, and her gaze fixed on the prairie landscape rolling past them. She had said very little since the ceremony, and Samuel wondered if she was having second thoughts about the drastic step they had taken. "It's beautiful out here," she said finally, her voice soft with what sounded like genuine appreciation. "I'd forgotten how vast the sky could be." Samuel followed her gaze to the endless expanse of blue above them, dotted with white clouds that cast moving shadows across the grassland. Margaret used to say that living under this much sky made a person's problems seem smaller. She said it was impossible to feel too sorry for yourself when you were reminded every day how big the world really is. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Samuel replied, and for the first time in days, speaking of Margaret didn't feel like reopening a wound. "I think she would have liked you, Mrs. Hayes." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the use of her new name, and Samuel realized it was the first time either of them had acknowledged the legal reality of their situation. "I hope so," Sarah said quietly. "I hope I can be worthy of her home." The Hayes ranch came into view as they crested a small hill, and Samuel watched Sarah's face carefully as she took in her new home for the first time. The house sat in a natural depression that protected it from the worst of the prairie winds, surrounded by a few hardy cottonwood trees that Margaret had coaxed to grow despite the harsh climate. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his work, and the remains of Margaret's flower garden still showed patches of color even in the advancing autumn. "It's larger than I expected," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "And those trees, they must have taken years to establish." "Margaret planted them the first spring we were here," Samuel replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Everyone said they wouldn't survive, but she was determined to have shade for our children to play under someday." He paused, the familiar ache settling in his chest. "They're strong now. They'll outlast both of us." Sarah was quiet as they approached the house, her eyes taking in every detail of the place that would now be her home. Samuel helped her down from the wagon and carried her single carpet bag to the front porch, suddenly acutely aware of how little she had brought with her into this new life. "Would you like to see the house?" he asked, his hand hesitating on the door handle. "Of course," Sarah replied, though Samuel caught the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she understood this moment was as difficult for him as it was significant for her. The front door opened into a parlor that still bore Margaret's touch in every detail. The sampler she had embroidered hanging on the wall, the cushions she had sewn for the chairs, the small collection of books they had accumulated over the years. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in with the same careful attention she had shown when they first met. "She had lovely taste," Sarah said quietly, running her fingers along the back of a chair upholstered in blue and yellow fabric. "Everything feels so lived in, loved." Samuel felt his throat tighten at her words. "I haven't changed anything since she died. I couldn't bring myself to." "Of course not," Sarah interrupted gently. "And you shouldn't. This is her home, Mr. Hayes. I'm just borrowing space in it." They moved through the house slowly, Samuel pointing out the kitchen with its large cookstove and well-stocked pantry, the dining room with the table Margaret had insisted they buy from a traveling furniture maker, and finally, the small room off the kitchen that would be Sarah's. "I brought in a bed from the spare room upstairs," Samuel explained, suddenly feeling awkward about the arrangements. "There's a washstand and a chest of drawers, and I cleared space in the kitchen for your things." Sarah set her carpet bag on the simple bed and looked around the small space with what appeared to be genuine satisfaction. "It's perfect, Mr. Hayes." More comfortable than many places I've stayed in recent months. The afternoon passed in practical arrangements. Sarah unpacked her few belongings, a handful of dresses, some books, a sewing kit, and a small silver locket that she placed carefully on the washstand. Samuel showed her around the rest of the property, explaining the routines of ranch life and the schedules that governed their days. "The cattle need to be checked twice daily," he said as they stood by the corral where several horses grazed peacefully. "And there's always something that needs mending or cleaning or fixing. It's not exciting work, but it's necessary." "I understand necessary work," Sarah replied, watching as one of the horses approached the fence, curious about the newcomers. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand toward the animal. Samuel nodded, surprised when the normally skittish mare allowed Sarah to stroke her nose without hesitation. "That's Duchess. She was Margaret's favorite. She doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Samuel had seen from her, as the horse nuzzled her palm. "My father had a horse very much like her when I was young. I spent many hours in the stable talking to her about all the things I couldn't say to people." "What kinds of things?" Samuel found himself asking, though he immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Sarah continued stroking the horse's neck, her expression growing distant. "Child things, mostly. Dreams about what I wanted to be when I grew up. Worries about whether my parents would always love me. Fears about the world being too big and dangerous for someone like me." She paused, her hand stilling on the horse's neck. "I thought I was done with fears like that." The vulnerability in her voice caught Samuel off guard. Throughout their brief acquaintance, Sarah had presented herself as completely self-possessed, a woman who had made peace with her circumstances and approached their arrangement with clear-eyed pragmatism. But standing in the gathering dusk with his wife's horse nuzzling her hand, she looked young and uncertain. "Fear isn't always a bad thing," Samuel said carefully. "Sometimes it keeps us alive long enough to figure out what comes next." Sarah looked at him then, and something in her expression made him think she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "Is that what you've been doing, Mr. Hayes? Staying alive long enough to figure out what comes next?" The question hit closer to home than Samuel cared to admit. "I suppose I have," he said, "though I'm not sure I've figured out much." They returned to the house as full darkness settled over the prairie, and Samuel began the evening routine of banking the fires and checking the locks. Sarah moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, preparing a simple supper from the supplies she found in the pantry. Watching her work in Margaret's space should have felt wrong, but instead Samuel found it oddly comforting to have another presence in the house, another set of hands contributing to the work of daily life. "Will you eat with me?" Sarah asked as she set plates on the kitchen table. "I know we haven't discussed meals, but it seems wasteful to cook separately." Samuel hesitated. He had grown accustomed to taking his meals alone, often eating while standing at the kitchen counter or sitting on the front porch, unable to bear the sight of Margaret's empty chair at the dining room table. "The kitchen is fine," he said finally, taking a seat across from her at the smaller table Margaret had used for everyday meals. They ate in relative silence, the awkwardness of their situation settling between them like an uninvited guest. Sarah had prepared beans and cornbread with competent efficiency, and Samuel found himself surprised by how good it tasted, the first meal he had truly enjoyed in months. "You're a good cook," he said, immediately feeling foolish for the simple compliment. "Thank you," Sarah replied. "I had to learn quickly after I no longer had my mother to rely on." The reference to her loss hung in the air between them, and Samuel found himself wanting to know more about the life she had left behind, the family she had lost, the woman she had been before grief and necessity had brought her to his door. "What were they like?" he asked. "Your family." Sarah's hands stilled on her fork, and for a moment Samuel thought she wouldn't answer. When she did speak, her voice was soft with memory. "My father was the gentlest man I ever knew. He could explain the most complex ideas in ways that made sense to anyone, and he never lost patience with a struggling student. My mother had the most beautiful singing voice, and she used to hum while she worked. My brother James was only 16, but he was so bright, so full of plans for the future." Her voice caught slightly. "He wanted to be an engineer. He was always building things, figuring out how they worked." Samuel heard the deep love in her voice, the kind of affection that spoke of a family bound together by genuine fondness, rather than mere obligation. It reminded him of his own feelings for Margaret, the way her absence had left holes in his daily life that no amount of time seemed able to fill. "They sound like good people," he said. They were. Sarah looked down at her plate, her appetite apparently gone. "Some days I think the worst part isn't that they're gone, but that no one else remembers them the way I do." It's like their whole existence depends on my memory now. Samuel understood that burden intimately. I know what you mean. Sometimes I catch myself wanting to tell Margaret about something that happened or ask her opinion about a decision. Then I remember, and it's like losing her all over again. Sarah looked up at him with something that might have been relief. Yes, exactly like that. They finished their meal in a silence that felt less awkward than companionable. Two people who had found an unexpected point of connection in their shared understanding of loss. After Sarah cleared the dishes, Samuel excused himself to check on the animals one final time, a ritual that had become as much about giving himself time to think as ensuring the livestock were secure. When he returned to the house, Sarah was sitting by the kitchen fire with a book in her lap, her auburn hair catching the light from the flames. She looked up as he entered, and something in her expression made him pause. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice careful, "I want you to know that I understand this arrangement is difficult for you. If there are ways I can make it easier, routines you prefer, spaces in the house that should remain private, please tell me." Samuel considered her offer, touched by her thoughtfulness. "I think we'll figure it out as we go along," he said finally, "but I appreciate you asking." Sarah nodded and returned to her book, and Samuel found himself reluctant to retire to his own room. There was something peaceful about the scene. The fire crackling in the grate, the soft sound of pages turning, the sense of another person sharing the space without demanding anything from him. For the first time since Margaret's death, the house didn't feel like a tomb. As he finally prepared for bed, Samuel reflected on the day's events with a mixture of amazement and uncertainty. He had begun the morning as a desperate man facing the loss of everything he held dear, and he was ending it as a married man with a stranger sleeping under his roof. The woman who now bore his name was nothing like what he had expected, more thoughtful, more complex, and far more damaged than her composed exterior initially suggested. But perhaps, he thought as he settled into the bed he had shared with Margaret for so many years, that damage might be exactly what would allow them to coexist without destroying each other. Two broken people might be able to build something functional from their shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything. Time would tell if he was right. The first weeks of their marriage passed in a carefully choreographed dance of courtesy and distance. Samuel and Sarah developed routines that allowed them to share the house and its responsibilities without intruding too deeply into each other's emotional territories. They took their meals together in the kitchen, their conversations polite but limited to practical matters: the weather, the condition of the cattle, supplies needed from town. Sarah proved to be everything she had claimed during their first meeting. She rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare breakfast, kept the house clean without disturbing Margaret's personal belongings, and threw herself into the physical demands of ranch life with a determination that surprised Samuel. Within a week, she had taken over the care of the kitchen garden, coaxing the last of the autumn vegetables from the increasingly stubborn soil. "The turnips are ready," she announced one morning as Samuel returned from checking the cattle, "and there are still some late tomatoes that might ripen if we get a few more warm days." Samuel paused in the doorway, watching as she arranged the freshly washed vegetables on the kitchen counter. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing the garden's bounty displayed in his kitchen again, something he hadn't realized he missed until this moment. Margaret always said the late tomatoes were the sweetest, he found himself saying. She used to make green tomato preserves with the ones that didn't ripen in time. Sarah looked up from her work, her hands still dusty from the garden. "I found her recipe book in the pantry. If you'd like, I could try making some." The offer caught Samuel off guard. He hadn't looked at Margaret's recipe book since her death, unable to bear the sight of her careful handwriting documenting years of domestic wisdom. But the thought of those preserves, of tasting something Margaret had loved, sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "I'd like that," he said quietly. She always made them in small batches, just enough to last through the winter. Sarah nodded and turned back to her vegetables, but Samuel caught the small smile that crossed her face before she bent to her work. It occurred to him that this might be the first time she had seen genuine pleasure in his expression since their marriage began. That afternoon, Samuel found himself drawn to the kitchen by the sound of Sarah humming, a low, melodic tune that reminded him of something his own mother used to sing when he was very young. Sarah stood at the stove, carefully stirring a pot of simmering preserves, her hair escaping its pins in the steam and her cheeks flushed from the heat. "That's a pretty song," Samuel said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "What is it?" Sarah's humming stopped abruptly, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was doing it. It's something my mother used to sing while she cooked. I suppose old habits." Please don't apologize, Samuel interrupted. It's been too quiet in this house for too long. The sound is pleasant. Sarah regarded him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to welcome any reminder of her previous life. After a moment, she resumed her humming, softer now but still audible above the gentle bubbling of the preserves. Samuel found himself lingering in the kitchen longer than usual, ostensibly mending a piece of harness but actually watching Sarah work. There was something graceful about her movements, a quiet competence that spoke of years spent managing household tasks with care and efficiency. When she tested the preserves by dropping a small amount onto a cold plate, her concentration was complete, her dark eyes focused intently on the task at hand. "I think they're ready," she announced finally, lifting the pot from the stove. "Would you like to taste them?" Samuel accepted the spoon she offered, tasting the sweet tart mixture that brought back a rush of memories so vivid he had to close his eyes for a moment. It wasn't exactly the same as Margaret's preserves. Sarah had added a touch of cinnamon that Margaret never used, but the essence was there, the careful balance of flavors that made even the sourest green tomatoes into something worth savoring. "It's perfect," he said, opening his eyes to find Sarah watching him anxiously. Margaret would have approved of the cinnamon. The relief that crossed Sarah's face made Samuel realize how much his opinion had come to matter to her, despite their businesslike arrangement. She had been trying to honor Margaret's memory while still making her own contribution to the household, a delicate balance that couldn't have been easy to achieve. "Thank you," Sarah said, beginning to ladle the preserves into the small jars Samuel had brought down from the pantry shelves. "I wasn't sure. I didn't want to presume to change her recipe, but cinnamon was always my mother's addition to fruit preserves. Sometimes combining traditions makes something better than either one alone," Samuel said, surprised by his own words. He hadn't intended to speak so philosophically, but watching Sarah blend her family's customs with Margaret's felt like witnessing something important, not a replacement of the old, but a respectful building upon it. As the days shortened and the first frost threatened the last of the garden, Samuel began to notice small changes in their dynamic. Sarah still maintained her emotional distance, still spoke of their arrangement in practical terms, but she had begun to anticipate his needs in ways that went beyond mere efficiency. She learned that he preferred his coffee stronger in the morning and weaker in the evening, that he read for an hour by lamplight most nights, and that he became restless when forced to remain indoors for too long. In return, Samuel found himself paying attention to Sarah's habits and preferences. She favored the chair by the kitchen window for her evening reading, always chose the warmest corner of any room, and fell silent whenever the wind howled too loudly around the house. He began banking the fires higher on windy nights, and learned to recognize the signs that she needed solitude to process whatever memories the weather had stirred up. One particularly fierce November storm kept them both confined to the house for 3 days, and Samuel discovered that extended proximity to Sarah was less uncomfortable than he had anticipated. She spent much of the time mending clothes and household linens, her hands moving with the same quiet competence she brought to all her tasks. On the second evening, as they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table, she with her needlework, he with account books that needed updating, Samuel realized he was genuinely content for the first time in months. "You're very peaceful to be around," he said without thinking, immediately regretting the personal nature of the observation. Sarah looked up from the shirt she was mending, her needle poised in mid-stitch. "Am I? I mean, some people fill up all the space in a room just by being there. You don't do that. You make space feel calmer." A complicated expression crossed Sarah's face, and she set down her needlework carefully. "My father used to say that I was born with naturally quiet corners. He said some people are like fireworks, brilliant and exciting, and others are like steady lamps, reliable and soothing." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I used to wish I could be more like a firework." "And now?" Samuel asked, finding himself genuinely curious about her answer. "Now I think there's something to be said for steady lamps," Sarah replied. "Fireworks are beautiful, but they don't last long enough to guide anyone home." The conversation stayed with Samuel long after they retired to their separate rooms. There had been something almost intimate about the exchange, a sharing of perspective that went deeper than their usual practical discussions. It made him wonder what other thoughts Sarah kept carefully hidden behind her composed exterior. The next morning brought clear skies and the promise of several good days before the next storm system arrived. Samuel was preparing to ride out to check on the cattle when Sarah appeared on the front porch, wrapped in Margaret's old wool cloak. "I'd like to come with you today if you don't mind," she said. "I've been inside too long, and I'd like to learn more about the ranch operations." Samuel hesitated, not because he objected to her company, but because riding the perimeter of the ranch would take them past Margaret's grave. He hadn't visited the hill since his wedding day, unable to face the complicated emotions that such a visit would bring. "It's a long ride," he said finally, "and we'll be passing some difficult terrain." "I'm a capable rider," Sarah replied calmly. "And I'm not afraid of difficult terrain, Mr. Hayes. I've been navigating it for months now." There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't talking only about the physical landscape, and Samuel found himself nodding before he could reconsider. "We'll take Duchess for you," he said. "She's the gentlest of the mares." Sarah's face lit up with the first genuinely happy expression Samuel had seen from her. "I'd like that very much." They rode out together in comfortable silence, the horses picking their way carefully across the frost-hardened ground. Sarah proved to be as competent a rider as she had claimed, sitting easily in the saddle and moving with Duchess as if they had been partners for years rather than weeks. As they checked the cattle and inspected fence lines, Samuel found himself explaining more than was strictly necessary, pointing out landmarks, describing the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, sharing stories about particularly memorable storms or difficult calving seasons. Sarah listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was learning to think like a rancher rather than merely following instructions. When they crested the hill where Margaret was buried, Samuel felt his chest tighten with the familiar mixture of grief and guilt. The wildflowers he had planted around the grave had gone dormant for the winter, leaving only their dried stalks to mark the careful garden he had created. Sarah reined in Duchess and looked at the simple wooden cross with quiet respect. "Would you like me to wait here while you visit?" Samuel considered her offer, touched by her understanding of what this place meant to him. But as he looked at Margaret's grave, he found that the overwhelming grief he usually felt here was tempered by something else, a sense that bringing Sarah to this place wasn't a betrayal, but perhaps a way of introducing the two most important women in his life. "You can come with me," he said quietly. I think Margaret would want to meet you properly." They dismounted and approached the grave together, their footsteps muffled by the frost-brittle grass. Samuel knelt to clear away some of the dried leaves that had blown against the cross, his hands working automatically, while his mind struggled with words. "Maggie," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is Sarah. She's helping me take care of the ranch now. She's been good to your garden, and she's making those green tomato preserves you loved." He paused, glancing up at Sarah, who stood quietly beside him with her hands folded. "I think you'd like her. She has your sense of practicality, and she makes the house feel less empty." Sarah knelt beside him and placed a small bouquet of late autumn asters, the last flowers blooming in the garden, at the base of the cross. "I hope I can be worthy of your home, Margaret," she said softly, "and I hope you don't mind sharing your husband's friendship with someone who needs it as much as I do." The word friendship hung in the air between them, and Samuel realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, their practical arrangement had indeed evolved into something that resembled friendship. They had learned to appreciate each other's company, to find comfort in shared routines, and to respect the boundaries that grief had drawn around both their hearts. As they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Samuel felt lighter than he had in months. The visit to Margaret's grave hadn't been the emotional ordeal he had anticipated. Instead, it had felt like a step forward, not away from his love for Margaret, but toward a future that might hold room for multiple kinds of affection. Winter settled over the Wyoming prairie with unusual gentleness that year, bringing light snows that dusted the landscape like powdered sugar, rather than the fierce blizzards Samuel had come to expect. As December progressed, he found himself increasingly aware of how much their daily routines had come to depend on each other's presence. Sarah's quiet efficiency had become as essential to the ranch's operation as his own knowledge of the land, and her steady companionship had filled silences he hadn't realized were echoing through his life. The changes had been so gradual that Samuel barely noticed them, until one evening in mid-December when he came in from the barn to find Sarah decorating the kitchen with pine boughs she had gathered from the few evergreen trees that grew near the creek. The warm light from the oil lamps caught the green needles and cast dancing shadows on the walls, transforming the familiar space into something that felt almost festive. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, looking up from where she was arranging a small bundle of pine above the window. "I know Christmas might be difficult this year, but I thought perhaps a little greenery might make the house feel more welcoming for the season." Samuel stood in the doorway, struck by how natural she looked in Margaret's kitchen, how seamlessly she had learned to navigate the rhythms of their shared life. The The pine boughs weren't an attempt to replace Margaret's Christmas traditions. They were something entirely new. Sarah's own gentle way of acknowledging the season without presuming to fill spaces that weren't hers to claim. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. Margaret always decorated for Christmas too, though she favored holly when she could find it. "Tell me about it," Sarah said, settling into her chair at the kitchen table. "What were your Christmases like?" Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee and joined her, surprised by how easily the memories came when Sarah asked about them. He found himself describing Margaret's elaborate Christmas dinners, her tradition of leaving small gifts in his boots on Christmas morning, and the way she always insisted on singing carols while she cooked, even though her voice was more enthusiastic than melodious. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah said when he finished, her voice warm with genuine affection for a woman she had never met. "I can see why you loved her so much." Something in her tone made Samuel look at her more closely. In the soft lamplight, with her hair loosened from its usual severe style and her face relaxed with listening, Sarah looked younger, more vulnerable than her usual composed self. "What about your family's Christmases?" he asked. "What traditions did you have?" Sarah's expression grew wistful, and she was quiet for so long that Samuel thought she might not answer. When she did speak, her voice carried the weight of loss that had become familiar to both of them. "My father would read the Christmas story from Luke every Christmas Eve, and my mother would make her special rum cake that took her 3 days to prepare properly. James always insisted on hanging our stockings by size order, smallest to largest, and he would sneak downstairs before dawn to see if anything had appeared in them." She smiled sadly. "Such simple things, but they made our house feel like the center of the world." "They don't have to stay in the past," Samuel said quietly. "Traditions can be adapted." Sarah looked at him with surprise, and Samuel found himself continuing before he could reconsider his words. "I mean, if you wanted to make your mother's rum cake, or if you wanted me to read the Christmas story on Christmas Eve, we could create new traditions that honor the old ones." The offer seemed to startle Sarah, and for a moment Samuel thought he had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made him realize how rarely he had seen her look genuinely happy. "I'd like that very much," she said, "though I should warn you, the rum cake is quite complicated. My mother always said it was temperamental and required constant attention." "I think we can manage temperamental," Samuel replied, feeling lighter than he had in years. "We've both had plenty of practice." Christmas Eve arrived crisp and clear, with a light snow falling that made the world look like something from a fairy tale. Sarah had spent the previous 3 days working on her mother's rum cake, muttering over measurements and timing with the same intense concentration she brought to all her tasks. The kitchen had been filled with the rich aromas of spices and rum, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that Samuel hadn't experienced since childhood. After their evening meal, they settled in the parlor, the first time Samuel had used the room since Margaret's death. Sarah had lit candles throughout the space, and the warm light made Margaret's careful decorating seem welcoming rather than haunting. Samuel retrieved the family Bible from its place on the mantelpiece and opened it to Luke chapter 2. "And it came to pass in those days," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions the familiar words stirred within him. As he read, he found himself watching Sarah's face in the candlelight, seeing how she listened with complete attention, her hands folded in her lap and her expression peaceful. When he finished reading, they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting me be part of this, for making room in your traditions for mine." Samuel closed the Bible and set it aside, looking directly at Sarah for perhaps the first time since their marriage began. Really looking at her, not just seeing the practical woman who shared his house and his responsibilities, but the person she was beneath the careful composure. "Sarah," he said, her name feeling different in his mouth somehow. "I need you to know something." She turned to face him fully, and in the candlelight, her dark eyes seemed to hold depths he had never noticed before. Not just sadness and loss, but warmth, intelligence, and something else that made his breath catch in his throat. "This arrangement we made," he continued, struggling to find the right words, "it's become something more than I expected. You've become more than I expected." Sarah's eyes widened, and Samuel saw something flicker across her face. Hope, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know we agreed this would be practical, nothing more, but I wanted you to know that having you here sharing this life with me, it's not just about keeping the ranch anymore. It's about having someone to share it with." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze never leaving his face. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but steady. "Samuel," she said, using his first name for the first time since their wedding day. "I need you to know something too." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand in both of hers, her touch warm and certain. "I came here because I needed shelter and security, but what I found—" She paused, searching for words. "What I found was someone who understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting, someone who showed me that it's possible to honor the past while still building something new." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief that had lived there for so long. Looking into Sarah's eyes, he saw not a replacement for what he had lost, but the possibility of something entirely different, not better or worse than his love for Margaret, but real and valuable in its own right. "I think," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "that perhaps we've both been healing each other without realizing it. And I think there might be room in both our hearts for something more than friendship, if we're brave enough to try." Samuel lifted his free hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone as he marveled at the courage it must have taken for her to speak so honestly about such fragile possibilities. "I'd like to try," he said quietly. "I'd like to see what we might build together, Sarah, not as a replacement for what we've lost, but as something new, something ours." When he kissed her, it was gentle and tentative, an exploration rather than a claiming. Sarah responded with equal care, her lips soft against his as they shared their first moment of true intimacy. It didn't feel like a betrayal of Margaret's memory or Sarah's grief. It felt like two people who had learned to carry their losses with grace, choosing to create something beautiful from the pieces of their broken lives. When they finally separated, Sarah rested her forehead against his, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she whispered. "I thought that part of me died with my family." "It didn't die," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was just waiting for the right person to help it heal." They spent the rest of Christmas Eve talking by the dying fire, sharing stories and dreams and tentative plans for a future that suddenly seemed full of possibility. When Samuel finally walked Sarah to her room, he kissed her hand formally like a suitor rather than a husband, a gesture that acknowledged they were beginning something new rather than simply continuing something old. The months that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Samuel and Sarah's relationship deepened gradually, built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding they had established during their first weeks together. They moved slowly, carefully, two people who had learned the value of what they were building and had no desire to rush its construction. By spring, Sarah had moved her belongings to the main bedroom, though she insisted on keeping some of Margaret's things exactly where they had always been, a gesture of respect that meant more to Samuel than she could possibly know. They planted the garden together that year, combining Margaret's practical vegetable rows with Sarah's flower borders, creating something that honored the past while embracing the future. On their first wedding anniversary, Samuel took Sarah back to Margaret's grave, where they left fresh flowers and spent a few quiet minutes in the presence of the woman whose love had made their own possible. It no longer felt like a betrayal to visit this place with Sarah. Instead, it felt like bringing two parts of his life together in harmony. "Thank you, Maggie," Samuel said quietly, his arm around Sarah's waist as they stood before the simple cross, "for teaching me how to love well enough that I could do it again." As they walked back to the house they now truly shared, Samuel reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them together. He had married Sarah to save his land, but what he had found in her dark eyes, compassion, strength, and the courage to love again after devastating loss had saved far more than property. It had saved his capacity for hope, his ability to believe in the future, and his faith that broken hearts could heal without forgetting what had broken them. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of sage and new grass as they reached their front porch, and Samuel paused to look back at the vast prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. This land had been the foundation of his life with Margaret, and now it would be the foundation of his life with Sarah. Not the same life, but one equally precious, and built on the understanding that love, in all its forms, was worth fighting to preserve. Sarah squeezed his hand as they climbed the steps together, her smile bright with the contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. In her eyes, Samuel saw not the shadow of his past, but the promise of their future, a future they would build together one day at a time, with the patience and care of people who knew the true value of what they had found in each other. "Thank you,